Afternoon and welcome to Broadband Breakfast live online, or good morning if you are viewing or participating from another location, which I am today. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and very happy to welcome you to, I guess, the second official Summer of Broadband series that we have been doing. We're focused on talking with state broadband officials in as many of the states as we can get to reasonably this summer. We had an event here in Utah, where I'm located, last week live with the state broadband officer and others who are part of the state broadband council in the state. And today we're going to have a wonderful opportunity to talk with three officials in the Indiana broadband office, or associated with the Indiana broadband office. So we are in for a real treat to drill into the logistics of how a state gets organized, both kind of before the pandemic and the response from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and subsequent, and many fascinating developments that Indiana has been responsible for. But before I introduce our guests, I want to remind everyone that please make sure you're muted. Don't turn your video on if you're not a panelist or participant. Do feel free, particularly if you're on Zoom, to ask questions. I think I'm able to get your questions from our other platforms too, but that hasn't been as active a place for questions. I just want to remind everyone that Broadband Breakfast, we are a news and events community. Our motto is better broadband, better lives. We are building and bringing people together around the technologies, the tools that enable get us to all get higher capacity internet. And boy, I mean, now is a real time to be engaged in this effort with the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act last November, and now the details of the program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, rolling forth. There are many, many opportunities to get better broadband throughout the country. As I said just a moment ago, we featured the state of Utah last week. Next week, kind of a bit of an orthogonal twist. We're going to be focusing in person on a rural community in Utah, Morgan City, Utah, talking about the way they've gotten higher capacity broadband. And then for the weeks in August, we're going to be returning to other state broadband leaders in our Summer of Broadband. I also want to thank the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast. We wouldn't be able to do the programming that we do without them. They include Utopia Fiber, Broadband Money, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the tools Broadband Money provides throughout this session. Broadband Now, Lightbox, Ookla, Google Fiber, Bitstream Communications, Inc., Pinpoint Capital Advisors, Powerhouse Management, Positron Access, Samsung, and also the California Emerging Technology Fund. Thank you to each of our sponsors for your participation in our programming. With that, let me go ahead and open our view up to our panelists. Looks like I need to make a small change here to hide the non-video participants. We are so pleased to be joined by Jody Golden, Roberto Gallardo, and Ernie Holtry. And I'll just say a tad more about their titles so that you can know where they're coming from. Jody is the State Infrastructure Administrator and the Chief Broadband Officer for the state of Indiana. We are so pleased that she can join us and give us a sense about the state and its approach to broadband. Following Jody will be Roberto Gallardo. Roberto's the director of the Purdue Center for Regional Development, and he's nationally recognized expert on broadband and rural communities, and he's written quite a bit about that. And I know he's played a very important role in some of the projects of the Indiana Broadband Office. So we're going to hear Roberto's perspective on these programs. And then batting cleanup will be Ernie Holtry, who's the program manager for the director of the Indiana Broadband Office in the state. And obviously Indiana, the governor's Eric Holcomb and Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch. And with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to you, Jody, to tell us a little bit about your background, your role, and how Indiana has approached its broadband deployment activities.
Sure. Well, Drew, thank you so much for having us on Broadband Breakfast. We're certainly honored to be here today. So my role with the state of Indiana is a new role. Each state, as you may be aware, has been asked to kind of appoint a point of contact that would be sort of the all things IIJA centered. And so Governor Holcomb has asked me to be the state infrastructure administrator. So I'm working closely with the agencies that are going to be touched by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So we're working through the formula dollars and the competitive dollars right now as we speak. But then I kind of play a dual role. I'm also serving as the chief broadband officer for the state as well. And that sort of stems from my previous experience, as you'll hear a little bit more today about the Office of Community and Rural Affairs, of which Ernie and Roberto both used to work with. And I used to be a former director at OKRA. We call it OKRA here for short here in Indiana. And so the agency itself is the grant administrator for broadband, but I have to give credit to Governor Holcomb and Lieutenant Governor Crouch. Broadband has long been a priority for Indiana and Governor Holcomb for some time now, and we started a broadband program back in 2018. And so I think, Drew, we might get into some specifics or details on that here in a second, but that's kind of how my involvement in broadband. And so coming from OKRA and having helped develop the Next Level Connections broadband program here in Indiana, and now serving in a different capacity with the infrastructure in general, but also working still very closely with Roberto and Ernie on the broadband side as well.
And just one more thing about your background, Jody. You've had a very extensive involvement in the various state agencies. I think you oversaw agencies in the portfolio, including Department of Agriculture, Office of Community and Rural Affairs, Indiana Destination Development Corporation, Indiana Housing and Community Development, et cetera, et cetera. This list goes on and on. So could you just speak about the importance of broadband in the functioning of a state administration like Governor Holcomb's administration?
Yeah, so I was also previously the chief of staff / chief of agency operations for our lieutenant governor, Suzanne Crouch. And so I was afforded the opportunity to be able to work with her portfolio of agencies as well. And as you mentioned, that's agriculture, that's OKRA, tourism, and housing. And so, as you know, I mean, everyone on this call knows the importance and the necessity of broadband. I think obviously the pandemic really brought that to light. And so, but when broadband touches really every aspect of our lives at this point. And so with agriculture, I'm amazed, not having an agricultural background. I learned so much at the time I was there, but at the technology involved, and the capability, the access needed for the technology involved in agriculture at this point. Obviously, we know we need it for basic life, for paying bills, for telehealth, for medicine. We need it for economic development. We need it for learning. We need it for working. So it really does touch every aspect of our lives at this point. And being involved in Lieutenant Governor's office really helped me gain my experience and gain the knowledge that hopefully we can provide and do statewide with our Indiana Broadband Office, which Ernie's going to highlight here in a few minutes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jody. Let's turn to Roberto, and I believe, Roberto, you kind of did a lot of work in another state, Mississippi, before your work now at Purdue. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got passionate about broadband, Roberto.
Sure, Drew. Thank you for having me here, and nice to see Jody and Ernie and all the participants. So as you mentioned, I started my career at Mississippi State University and in rural development, rural economic development. And since about 10 years ago or a little bit more, we realized the potential of broadband. So since then, we've been working with rural communities, helping them better understand the technology, its limitations, its potential, so forth. And from an economic workforce development perspective. And in those efforts, Drew, we realized quickly we needed to come up with some sort of data and metrics to help communities understand the concept that way before COVID, it was kind of abstract. Honestly, it was high up here. What is the digital divide? And so we did a lot of education and awareness around the concept itself and its implications for quality of life, economic development, et cetera. As time went by, we developed programs that have to do more with adoption and use. We did get slightly involved in infrastructure, but more so on connecting providers with communities. But our focus has always been mostly on the adoption and internet use piece, and also to identify groups within the community that are being left behind or that are not as active online like they should be, which leads to the digital equity piece. I then moved to Indiana and continued my work there. We did a ton of broadband surveys here over the past 3 years, Drew, right before COVID or during COVID. We also continued to develop programs. We just unveiled the Indiana's first regional digital inclusion plan. So we really focused. Infrastructure is a very important piece, don't get me wrong, but as we all know here on the call, there's other factors as well that are important to truly make a community or region competitive and digital inclusive. And so that's what we, as a university, as the Office of Engagement, it is in our mission to go out there and engage and help and increase awareness and plan and do all these fun things with communities across Indiana and the nation. I've been honored and humbled to work with multiple regions and communities outside of the state. So my spiel here, Drew, basically is we are driven by digital inclusion, by data, by empowering local communities, and by building capacity around this very, very complex topic.
And I think I remember reading that a lot of your previous work in Mississippi was involved with the extension program. And I'm just wondering, Purdue is a state university?
It is the land grant, yes.
Great. And so do they have a similar extension program? And what role does that program play in your work in broadband in Indiana?
That's a great question, because indeed extension is a very, very critical piece, especially if you want to reach more of a rural network. Extension educators have been trained on digital inclusion, some here at Purdue, some at Mississippi State. There's a national effort now going on to train educators across the country. And the number one reason for that, Drew, is because they live and work in those communities. They are trusted. And so they are typically very good facilitators or connectors between the community and its needs with providers, but also with content development and training and so forth. So extension has played and will continue to play a very important role in moving the needle, not only on the awareness side, but also on the planning side and on the digital equity front.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for being with us. And now let's turn to Ernie Holtree. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and the kind of key work you're doing shepherding a lot of these activities at the Indiana Broadband Office.
Sure. Thank you, Drew. I've been with the Indiana Broadband Office about 2.5 years now. Prior to that, I was with OCRA, or as Jody mentioned, the Office of Community and Rural Affairs, where I was a liaison covering about 20 counties on the eastern portion of Indiana as a local rep of the state. Worked with some of Roberto's extension offices at that time, along with our state partners that Jody mentioned prior. So the Indiana Broadband Office was established in 2018 by Lieutenant Governor Crouch, and she brought on a highly qualified individual that had done some amazing things in South Central Indiana in his small town. His name was Scott Rudd, and then Scott recently moved on. We still have some great relationships with him, and he is helping us lead the charge into rural Indiana for the local engagement. At the Indiana Broadband Office, we market ourselves as the one-stop shop for all things broadband in the state of Indiana. And we say right up front that as such, we do not have all the answers to every question or inquiry that comes into our office. But what we're tasked with is to make sure that inquiring party is able to be connected to someone at the state or federal or maybe even local level to get their question answered in a timely manner. So a lot of the work that we do here is facilitation, assisted with developing the state strategic plan, and now, as I'm sure we'll talk about on the second half of the meeting, IIJA and BEAD and digital equity and all things coming down the pipeline for us in the next couple of years.
Well, thank you for being with us and for these observations. So I want to just give a shout out and kudos to my colleague, Sarah Lai Sterland. Sarah has led the work that Broadband Breakfast began in helping Broadband Money develop profiles of state broadband leaders and every state broadband agency information. And she did a wonderful profile of you, Ernie, and Roberto, kind of a dual profile. The link to it is on the page for this event. And it really has some great links and references to a lot of material that Indiana has developed. And that's kind of what I wanted to go through, maybe chronologically, but correct me or redirect me if there's something that really needs to be shouted out first. So, for example, I think it was 2015 that you developed a key part of this program. Was it the Steps to Success or the Broadband Ready Communities? Who would
that
like?
Was the Broadband Ready Communities program. It was established in 2015 into Indiana Code and was housed under the Indiana Economic Development Corporation for the first few years. And then in 2019, Indiana Code moved that over to be administered by OCRA. And OCRA asked the Indiana Broadband Office to manage that. So that is a program that we have in Indiana. Cities, towns, and counties are all eligible to apply. Their local unit of government is passing an ordinance that has 4 simple do's and 4 simple don'ts in that. The main do is to establish a single point of contact. So we like to see those local units of government have a single point of contact for all things broadband, just like our office is in the state of Indiana. And then other administrative and clerical opportunities, such as how quickly they're able to review permits from providers, submitted from providers, accepting documents electronically, electronic signatures. And then on the don't side, making sure they have an open mind and are not discriminating one provider to another, that they're open for business year-round on accepting permits, and there's no moratorium on permit issuance and submission. So we find those mainly counties taking advantage of that designation, and we say it does 2 things. Number one, it signals to their residents that local leaders are doing something on their behalf with the name broadband in it. When they become designated, we give them a media toolkit to work with to promote that designation. And then number 2, it signals to the providers that the county, city, or town is open for business. They've taken a deep dive into their permitting structure, and they're ready to really engage in those meeting room discussions about how we can extend coverage to the unserved.
So what happened, or maybe I should say 2 parts. What led to that Broadband Ready Communities? Great name, right? And this was early in this game, this round, so to speak. And then following that in 2018, what was the next step? The creation of the Broadband Office, correct? Is that right? Mm-hmm. How did that flow from the Broadband Ready Communities? Who wants to tackle that?
Well, yeah, I think I can, and Ernie and I can kind of try to tag team this one. So the Broadband Ready Communities program was established. I think actually it was before I was even involved, and Ernie was even involved in broadband. And there were some providers who it looks to be may even be on the call or the webinar today that were heavily involved in the creation of that program through state code as well. So that was a program that we were happy to take on since broadband did become a priority and has been for Governor Holcomb. And so with that, it kind of led into the governor devoting about $100 million towards broadband, expanding broadband here in the states, working with the providers themselves, and then also the legislature. We developed what we're calling the Next Level Connections Broadband Grant Program. And so we've been working on that since 2018. It is a competitive grant program that was focused on getting unserved Hoosiers the access to be able to connect to broadband.
So please go continue.
No, and so we've seen moving forward, we've we've awarded, I should say, about 80 million, close to 80 million, 78 million of those first 100 million that was dedicated towards broadband. And we're into round 3 at this point. So we've seen a few different iterations of the program. I think we've had some lessons learned and worked with the legislature and the providers on tweaking the statute and the guidelines of the program as we've kind of moved forward. But it's been a good experience. And I think we just have to commend the governor and lieutenant governor for their vision for seeing broadband as a priority long before the IIJA was even formed. And so we continue, we're looking forward to the BEAD program and the DEA program as well. But fortunately, we were able to then, because of the NLC program, that's what bred the Indiana Broadband Office. And so it's, as Ernie mentioned, Scott Rudd used to run that. Ernie is the head guy here now at the Broadband Office, and handles all of the activities of the Broadband Office that does feature, mainly a lot of constituent and technical assistance from across the state. And he works with essentially local leaders. He works with the providers themselves. He works with constituents who are having issues. And so we're happy to be able to provide those services along with our grant program.
Well, a point that doesn't get emphasized enough, it is true, and it's a positive. Broadband is a bipartisan issue, right? I mean, the broadband infrastructure bill passed by a very bipartisan vote of 69-30. Here you are talking about putting $100 million. This is like 2 years before the pandemic, right? I mean, in 2018, and you have a Republican governor, have had for many years a Republican governor. And so, could you just speak to that briefly about, like, are there tensions or even just divisions politically on broadband, or is it just uniform? Everyone recognizes the need, and that it includes dollars. It includes state and federal dollars to fix the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all agree that, especially since the pandemic, but even before that, broadband, there's many rural areas of the state. There's even urban areas that may need help with their broadband services. Of course, Roberto and his team have been working on digital literacy and digital inclusion for some time now. And so I think, we've all agreed that broadband at this point is something that every Hoosier needs. And so that first step, putting that first 100 million towards broadband access, I think was Governor Holcomb's way of at least taking that first step. We knew it wasn't going to solve the whole problem, but it was at least a step in the right direction. And so the providers have been a great partner along the way. They've done a lot of work on their own outside of the grant program. And so we want to commend them for their work in trying to solve this issue. But we're excited that we can all agree on this. And it's just, like I said, we've had different iterations of the program. We've lived and we've learned through the different guidelines and the different restrictions. And so we don't always agree on every aspect of it, but I think it's been a pretty good partnership thus far, and moving forward, we look forward to the future with it.
In a few moments, we do want to get to the IIJ, but there's still a couple things that were worth talking about kind of before that, including the state broadband, the state strategic plan that I think you came out with in 2020. And could you also just delineate a little bit of the difference between the next level connectivity broadband and the Indiana connectivity program? Roberto, do you want to tackle that? I know you've been involved in some of those, or both of those programs.
I'm really gonna punt it to Ernie. I think he has a more inside knowledge about that.
We'll let him start, but we'll come back to you.
Thanks, Roberto. So the strategic plan was kind of a reaction to the USDA Reconnect requirement that we were going to be able to help the providers immensely on the USDA Reconnect grant if we had a strategic plan put together. Given that we had some great momentum going already with the Next Level Connections program, it then seemed like the ideal time to kill two birds with one stone and really work on that strategic plan. Coming out of that plan, which was a roadshow that I believe Jody led with several other state leaders and many of the providers on the call, to go to various communities and organizations and do some real fact-finding, boots on the ground to help inform that strategic plan. One of the key pieces that came out of that strategic plan was what I think now is pretty obvious to all of us, in that in some of those small rural communities, 1 or 2 or 5 people all wear so many hats, and they're juggling lack of total leadership capacity. So we were able to identify that there were some real movers or shakers in those communities, and we wanted to find a way to recognize those individuals. So out of that strategic plan, we came up with an idea called Community Champions. So we tasked our PR firm with going out on the road and actually doing interviews with individuals that we nominated as some of those community champions that we met along the way, as well as were flushed out in the Broadband Ready Communities program. So we're able to highlight the work of individuals, boots on the ground in those small communities, and then have that hosted on Instagram and YouTube, and really be able to highlight what a few individuals in a small community are able to do.
Well, and you can see how you're building one success on another. Your Broadband Ready Communities 2015, the Next Level Connectivity 2018, the Strategic Plan 2020, and kind of each is it just, I mean, this could be obvious, but not everyone's done this, right? So do you have any thoughts about, again, this taking us to the pandemic, what you all had done in the state of Indiana to get you to that point, and then how did that aid in the response when there was so much of a greater attention and need on good broadband connectivity?
Sure. I'll talk real quick, and then I'm sure Jody has a couple things to add. We were very quickly able to react to closures during the pandemic, because we had just come off this roadshow of public engagement, and because we had those existing contacts in those small communities, and we had a very strong relationship with the providers and the associations, that we started holding every Tuesday roundtable calls, and we had state agency heads on those calls as well as the providers, and we got into granular discussions and went all the way back to availability of personal protective equipment, and would one provider have an excess of something that another didn't, and we started talking about trouble calls and how maybe one provider could react to a trouble call for someone else in a time of need. So we were very granular in those discussions, and I think the reason we were able to pivot so quickly to those Tuesday calls is because the work that we had done previously with the provider associations and with the local units of government.
Well, and I think, yeah, I'd love to highlight, to build on what Ernie's saying, the fact that we have these relationships with the telecommunication associations and their memberships, that we have good relationships with the legislature that's been involved in framing the programs each year. We've got a new consortium that's been built with the Farm Bureau and Duke Energy and some other private partners that have been helpful. I think, I really commend our team and the really the general public, but those partners and the providers themselves that have really stepped up, and we've been able to work together through this, through these last few years, to build upon where we were coming from. And so I think Indiana was fortunate that we had a little bit of a head start. I know some offices, I'm on national broadband, Ernie and I both are national broadband calls, I think weekly, and then I have my counterparts in every state regarding infrastructure. And some states are really starting at ground zero, as far as not having a broadband office, not having any staff, not really understanding what needs to be done. So I really do think Indiana had a little bit of a leg up, that we were ahead of the game when it comes to broadband expansion. And then really when the pandemic hit, what needed to be done. I think, Drew, you mentioned too, a question previously to step back between the difference between the Next Level Connections program, and we have a new program called the Indiana Connectivity Program, and that was a newer program that was also included in the legislation. And so we kicked that off, what was it, the year before last, I believe, technically. And so it is a little bit of a flip of the Next Level Connections program. So the NLC original program is focused on awarding grant dollars to providers after they apply with project areas. So they come to the state and say, we want to serve this area, these census blocks or these locations, and we're looking for this amount of money to do so. The ICP, as we call it, is sort of the flip of that. And so we created a portal where the everyday Hoosier or business owner could input their information into this portal. They can mail it to us, or they could call the call center and give it to us and say, hey, sort of raise their hand that they need broadband or they want broadband. And so we collect that information, put that out essentially for the providers to look at, so they can say, hey, I already served this person or I don't. And then eventually we put those addresses or those locations out for bid. So the providers are then able to bid on serving those locations that have raised their hand to say, hey, I need and I want broadband. So we're in round, I think we're getting ready to open round 3, if I'm not mistaken. We don't have someone from Okra on the call today, but they're the group in the weeds on that program. But I think our first round, we didn't really know what to expect. We had data input. We had a lot of data come into the system. I think there's mixed emotions on some providers really like that ICP program. Maybe some providers say, aren't as interested in it. There are some restrictions in it per code that limit how much money we can award per location. And so that, I think, I'm sure, of course, weighs into the telecommunications providers' decisions on how they approach the program, but it's just another option for our Hoosiers.
Interesting to have both a supply side and a demand side program, so to speak. Okay, IIJA is obviously the big news animating a lot of state broadband activities. The high level view is of the 65 billion in the bill. 42.5 is going to the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, and that is essentially being distributed through state offices like your own. So how has that infusion, or soon to be infusion, of funds impacted your plans, how you think about broadband, and what you're doing day by day to kind of track and hopefully measure progress against your state broadband goals? Who wants to tackle that one first?
I think we all three can approach it, but I mean, I'll start. I think the BEAD program, although it's going to be a heavy lift for everyone, for the state, for the providers, and for Hoosiers, I think it's going to help us reach that end goal of getting everybody served. And so we had that head start with Next Level Connections, and this will build on that program. And so we're excited about it. I think we've seen projections of Indiana possibly being able to receive anywhere from 500 million to $1 billion, perhaps, based on, of course, the FCC maps that are coming out. And so we're excited about that hopefully solving our expansion and our access issue. But I think we also have to look at our own capacity. And so to be able to utilize and administer those dollars, we may have to do some planning on our end as far as staff capacity and the capacity here, whether that looks internally, whether that's outside assistance, and then also putting together the plan of what does the program look like. Is it a branch of NLC, the current program we have? Is it a completely look? Is it a combination of multiple programs? So we've got a lot of work to do. We're excited about it, but I think we're all kind of nervous together about it, but we're excited. Ernie, Roberta, I don't know if you have any comments.
Well, and I want to hear from both of you, but just to jump in, I mentioned earlier that we've been working with Broadband Money on state by state resources, and I've just put in the chat window, and it's also on the page for this event, the link to the Broadband Money page for Indiana. It provides contact information for Ernie as the program manager, project manager, and Broadband Money has estimated 671 million to 763 million based on some calculations involving population, speed. So in that range that you've just specified, and if you click on the portion that says to launch the Indiana Broadband Grant Portal, it will open up maps of data that Broadband.Money has been able to collect from sources about speed data and others. And again, this fits into the puzzle that we're all trying to solve of how to make sure we get the unserved and underserved connected to better broadband capacity. So I again want to hear from Ernie and Roberto both about, just some of the details, the nitty gritty of how IIJA has, again, you had and have a robust program, but with this new funding, how does that change, if at all, the way you approach your activities, Ernie?
Well, I think knowing that we just awarded about 189 million in round 3, and knowing we have 4 to 5 times that amount coming down the pike, and the Fed's expectation, right, that this does solve the digital divide, that we do find a way to connect every Hoosier with this money. And one of the things I think we were most excited about in this process with BEAD and digital equity is how the two need to coexist and work together. So with this great relationship that we have with Roberto up at Purdue, we're excited to be able to head out into our communities, work with our network that we've already established at the local level and that Roberto's established at the local level, and put together a quality BEAD program simultaneous to while we are assisting Roberto with the digital equity plan. There, Drew's back.
I'm back. Thank you. Always be prepared for the eventualities. So Ernie, when I got lost, I heard you just saying you have given out 189 million, and now you realize you have potentially 3 times that amount. Would you be willing to continue where you left off there?
Sure. And then as we look to plan on how to most efficiently use those funds, we're very fortunate to have that local task force and those local broadband ready communities in the engagement that we've already done on top of what Roberto and Purdue have already done at the local level. So as we create our BEAD 5-year plan and the digital equity plan, we already have those existing relationships on working together to make sure that those plans align with each other.
Roberto.
I was trying to unmute. Well, I'm very excited on 2 main things, Drew. The first one is what Ernie kind of dovetailing what he just said, is that community engagement component that's like in the bill. I think that that's a very, very good opportunity to work with providers and communities to really come up with the best way on how to spend this amount of money on the infrastructure piece, right on the BEAD side of things. And we're happy to help and assist Jody and her team and Ernie and everybody else on the state government providers, et cetera, et cetera. That component, I think, is pretty interesting and exciting. And on top of that, Drew, is also the digital equity piece that comes kind of parallel to that, and that we're going to be really, truly coordinating and talking to each other to ensure that they complement. Because as you know, there's slightly different issues that we're trying to figure out here, but on top of all that, you have that community engagement, that community listening piece that I think it's going to be, if it's well done, and I'm sure we're going to do a very good job at it, I think it's going to provide richer information and ideas and other perspective to this issue that has been going on since, the early 2000s when they started kind of talking about the digital divide. Since the late 90s, actually, as you know, Drew. So I'm really, really excited about that community engagement piece, which is going to be, to me, very, very powerful, a unique opportunity, but also working together on the BEAD piece and the DEA piece. I think it's going to be also a winner there.
Yeah, and of course, referring to the Digital Equity Act piece, and we did have a discussion 2 weeks ago with your neighboring state of Ohio and their application that was due, as they all were, on July 12th for digital equity planning grants. Roberto, I want to just get you to say a few more words. This is something that was in the piece that I referenced on Broadband.Money, and again, Sarah Lai Sterling had noted that you helped Okra manage its broadband state programs, and went on to say that following ARPA funding guidelines, this program gave priority to projects that can provide symmetrical speeds of at least 100 megabits per second to as many locations as possible. Could you just address this? We haven't talked about speed today, which is odd given we're 2/3 of the way through, and a lot of times that comes up quite quickly. But could you just speak to how we get highest capacity and reliability speeds and service to awardees of different programs?
Sure. So let me back up a little bit and just say that I was honored and humbled when Jody and her team approached me to help them kind of get their broadband programs last October off the ground. The structure was already in place. I really just kind of came in there and helped them manage the program for 6 months. I teased my fellow faculty members here that I was on loan to Okra for those 6 months, and it was a great experience. It was a get your hands dirty type of experience, and I'm very, very thankful for that. About the speed situation, Drew, the bill says that we've got to give priority to, I think, under 120. But the network should be able to deliver 100 over 100. And symmetrical is really a very sticky situation in a way, because before COVID, we were used to consuming or downloading more. Because of COVID, that kind of sped up a ton. And now we're also producing or uploading. And during COVID, as you know, Drew, a lot of homes realized that their internet, they thought it was sufficient, but when they factored in the upload speed, it was not. So when the bill came up with this symmetrical concept, to me, I was pleasantly surprised about that requirement, because I think that that's the way to go, especially now that the odds of the post-COVID world are going to be more digital than the pre-COVID world. And so obviously there's these guidelines that's going to be established in conjunction with providers and everybody else as part of the BEAD requirements, right? Kind of the rules, but the speeds there, that symmetrical component, I was not expecting that, but it did come through. Mm-hmm. And I just saw a question from somebody.
Well, let me share them so everyone can see. Dan Smith has asked 2 good questions here. The first is, what is the average cost per new broadband connection in the Indiana Great program? Let's take that one first. And then he asked to follow up, please tell us a little more about identifying and recruiting community champions. And for others who are watching or listening, please feel free to share your questions on the Zoom stream, or I should be able to see them on the other platforms too. But who wants to tackle the first one about cost per new broadband connectivity?
Well, I think, Dan, I don't know if you want to get a little bit more specific, but we'll try to answer what we can. So every year we have to, per our code that we follow, have to determine what the average cost per passing is. And so that's what helps dictate how much we can award through our Indiana Connectivity Program. I believe, and again, we don't have anyone from Okra on the call, I believe the last one was around $4,800. But that's going to change yearly. And we all know that, reaching a certain rural connection is going to cost more than, someone who's in a more dense area. And so that will change. On the second piece, the average project cost, we have a limit of, we can only award up to $5 million per project. And so we, of course, we require a minimum of 20% match, but we, of course, encourage as much match as possible. And that's incentivized via our award process or our scoring process. And so the more match you provide, the better overall your application will be. But we award anywhere from, less than $1 million to up to the $5 million, I think. It just depends on the size of the project.
What about the process of identifying, recruiting community champions? Who'd like to speak a little bit more to that?
Sure. We had started to notice early on that communities were starting to throw together their groups and start to call them task forces. And out of those community task forces, we found some that were more organized and efficient than others, of course, but the locals had started that process. So we were very lucky there. And then we just started to look at who from those task forces were reaching back to state government and asking us questions. And at that point in time, it became very easy to identify the first 6 or 8 individuals that were clearly making that big difference in those communities. We saw some of those task force groups overlapping and dialoguing with Roberta. So we could really see how far along those were. And we just wanted to find a way to take those individuals that were doing that heavy lifting and highlight them. So those first few were just starkly obvious to us on how we could highlight those individuals. Since then, we've done a call out and we've asked for anyone that follows our social media or our newsletter that if they have someone in mind in their community, that to please reach out and nominate them to us.
I want to tackle a question that we also haven't talked a lot about, which is mapping and broadband mapping. And in our discussion with Utah last week, that actually ended up being quite an important topic because Utah is one of the states that continued its state broadband office from the first round, the State Broadband Initiative in 2009. After the funding evaporated for that in 2014, Utah from state funds continued it. And the broadband officer, Rebecca Dilk, had spoken about how mapping was so important. Could you just speak to what was or has been the role of mapping? Are you doing one, not doing one, and your thoughts on that? And that will lead into the question Chris Bailey has asked here that I'll ask and I'll address in just a moment. But if you could just start off with what Indiana has done in terms of a broadband map.
Yeah, and I'll start off, but I'll let Roberto and Ernie fall in if they would like. So when we started out, we were using the FCC data, and then I think as a state, we've just been adding to that. So we try to input the RDOF data, we try to input the USDA data if we can find it. Then we have been, as I mentioned earlier, there's a consortium that has been built outside of the state. It's a consortium of the Indiana Farm Bureau, and they put together some private sector partners. They've launched a speed test, or where we're collecting speed test data from across the state. That has not been put into the map, but that is something that we are at least looking at and utilizing. What we've also included in our current map is, of course, the areas that we've previously awarded through our state grants. So the map, to Chris's question on the chat, I think is kind of a mix of a number of data sources, but it's using FCC data, but it's something that the state has put together. Roberto, do you have any or Ernie comments on that?
Yes, I was going to say one thing we tried to stress was that our map was a starting point for our next level connections round 3, and we at various levels tried to encourage documentation of areas that maybe the map was not highly accurate, because if those were residents that were not receiving service, to encourage the providers to apply for those addresses, even though the map may have said differently. And in some of those, we had a challenge process, and they would go one way and some went another. But I think we can safely say that we did in round 3 fund areas where originally the map appeared to show service, but the locals or the provider applying was able to document it wasn't what it needed to be. So we're very fortunate that Hoosiers will now be connected for that reason.
To Chris Bailey's question, he asked concerning the broadband map on the link. And again, I asked you the question I just asked to see if there's an Indiana state map that one can access, and I haven't found that yet. So please point me to it, and we'll put it on the page if there is. What I put in the link here is the Broadband.Money portal for Indiana State Broadband Office, and Broadband.Money has put these together for all 50 states and territories. And as you click through on that portal, this has recently been released, and so we encourage everyone to go to explore it. What has been done is integrating speed test data from Ookla, speedtest.net, from Measurement Lab, from FCC Form 477 data, and other sources with some good demographic information. And then basically an assessment, right? A guess of, is this area served? Is it underserved? Is it unserved, or likely or arguably? And so again, this is a census block by census block, and we'll get to even more refined as we start to get address level data and information. But we certainly invite everyone to take a look at that, to offer feedback to Broadband.money, but also to you all. I mean, because you are the key, right? You three here and others in Okra, right? We understand we can't get everyone from the state on the call, but you know, to have Jody Golden and Ernie Holtree here, who are leading the effort in the state on broadband, you know, you will have to make decisions. And I kind of want to maybe use our last, you know, few minutes here to get at, from additional to questions that pop in, how are you thinking about the process of actually deciding among providers who come to you and want access to these funds? How do you do it right now? Okay, so like that 189 million you just awarded, you've got you know, point scales and so forth. But how are you thinking about the process you're going to use, and is it going to be that you know, supply side or demand side approach that we chatted about earlier? So let's get Jody and Ernie to weigh in on that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're open for all ideas at this point. I think Next Level Connections has been a great starting point. As I mentioned earlier, we've had different iterations of it. We've tweaked a few things along the way. Is that something that we look to continue, perhaps tweaking it maybe in ways that make sense for everyone? I think, you know, the ICP program is another approach. I think, you know, we're also looking for bigger ideas, more transformational type programs where perhaps it's not just based on one simple project, but a larger area or a larger, you know, so just a more transformational program. And so I think we're open to anything at this point. And that's what I think we're looking forward to, putting together the 5-year plan so that we can see if there are other ideas out there and how we can be the best stewards of these dollars to make sure that we do get everyone and every Hoosier access at some level moving forward.
Ernie, additional thoughts on that?
Yes, I saw a question pop up in the chat that kind of goes along with this relative to schools. In our Indiana code, we gave we added some strong language to prioritize schools and rural health clinics. So that alone was a column on our Next Level Connections application and in our scoring considerations. And then with the Indiana Connectivity Program, while that's an individual or a business, I think we would probably identify a school in that category if we saw that need. I don't know that we've had one applied thus far, but we could possibly cover a school that way. But there was definitely priority given to applications that involve schools or clinics in round 3 of Next Level Connections.
What is involved on your end, Jody and Ernie, and Roberto is kind of advisor to them? How do you view this requirement in BEAD to get the next phase of your plan? I mean, obviously, you put in your letter of intent by 2 days ago, the 18th, and then by August 15th, you need to have more information, more detail provided, and then that will lead to a 5-year plan. So just tell us a little bit about what's on your mind. What are your worries? What's keeping you up late at night as you think about meeting the responsibilities of the BEAD program?
There's probably too many to mention since keeping Ernie and I both up at night, and Roberto too. But Roberto's been great on the digital equity side, so we're fortunate to have his partnership on the digital equity side. On the BEAD side, I think Ernie and I are in the midst of, we're putting together that application for the planning grant as we speak. We were just talking this morning. I think what we're, two of the things I think that keep us up are, one, putting together the budget request for the planning funds, not knowing exactly what everything's going to entail and how much it might cost to do it. I think that concerns us. And then also, really more importantly, making sure that we perform the adequate amount of public outreach. I think we want to make sure that we hit every population we can possibly hit, that we can talk to all of our partners, all of our stakeholders across the state. And so how do we, from a capacity standpoint, make that happen to make sure we get all of the information that we possibly can to put into this plan? So those are probably the two things that keep me up. Ernie, are they, I don't know what that's similar for you, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think NTIA has done a great job of giving us guidance in how they structured the due date of the digital equity prior to the BEAD. We were able to, after we asked Roberto to update his plan 36 times, I think we really came out of the digital equity process that was due a week or so prior, understanding what's expected in a narrative, what's expected in a budget, and then what's expected in a budget narrative. So now taking the guidance issued by NTIA and using our 1,000 words efficiently in that BEAD narrative to cover all the different sections we need to cover. And then along with what Jody said of trying to make an educated estimate on some of these categories. With digital equity, I think we were working towards about a $1 million budget. And with this, we'll be working towards a $5 million budget. So trying to break that $5 million down into the numerous categories ahead of time, looking into the future will be a real challenge.
Right. And that's a 1 million and 5 million budget for you all, for your staffing and running the program, not obviously a budget for what you're going to get. That's more in the 600 to 700 million dollar range. Well, this has been a wonderful discussion. I want to remind our audience here now and in the future that we will be back next Wednesday, the 27th, with a discussion about bringing broadband to rural Utah, the community of Morgan, Utah. And then we'll be continuing with our Summer of Broadband series with different state broadband offices during the month of August. Before thanking our panelists, let's give each of you a chance to offer some final thoughts, not just about the BEAD program, although that may be a part of it, but just what you view the next step for broadband in the state of Illinois. And let's go with Roberto first, and then Ernie, and we'll give you the last word, Jody.
Well, I think the team is, and we're definitely excited about this possibility. I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and I think it's a great team. There's a lot of heavy lifting, as Jody and Ernie mentioned, but I think that it's a fantastic opportunity to really move the needle on the digital divide issue, which has been, haunting us for a while now. So I'm really excited about that opportunity, and I look forward to continue working with this great team.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us, Roberto. Ernie.
Yes, it's super exciting to know what's coming down the pipe. I think at times when we're talking in rooms of educated individuals on this specific topic, like the listeners today, that we tend to many times talk over what the public would know and understand. So as we break down our language and we get out into the communities, we found the locals in Indiana to be so receptive of anything that we give them from an education standpoint, whether that's a PDF or a webinar or a phone call or an in-person meeting, that they are just gathering up the information that we're able to distribute. So I think it's just a very exciting time to finish this job that we started years ago in Indiana.
Great. Thanks again, Ernie, for making this happen. Jody, what are your final thoughts?
Well, first off, I couldn't be more grateful for the team that we have with Ernie and with Roberto and even our partners over at Okra. I think together we talk daily, and it's a team effort, and we couldn't get anything done without the team effort. But even more importantly, I mentioned this earlier, they just repeated it. There's a lot of work to do. We got to get every Hoosier served. There's a lot of work required with the notice of funding opportunities within these programs. And we're not going to be able to do it without our partners, without our providers, without our stakeholders. And so I want to thank all of them, many of them on the call today, in advance for what you're going to do with us and for us as we move towards getting everybody served here in the Hoosier State.
Well, wonderful. On behalf of Jody Golden, Roberto Gallardo, and Ernie Holtree, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Take care, everybody.